Okay, so hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Default Global. This is where we connect with global first entrepreneurs and remote work experts from all around the world. Our guest today is Viktor Petersson, CEO at Screenly. Victor, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, bud.
Sure. So, Victor, before we start, could you please introduce yourself and maybe share um, some of your background?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Viktor Petersson. I'm the co-founder of Screenly. We do digital signage, which basically is a fancy industry term for display management. So these screens you'd see around the world in retail environments or dashboards on the wall. We do screens that drive those. And yeah, we're doing this for 10 years now, and we've
Hmm.
been remote since inception, actually.
Okay, sounds good. And yeah, let's talk about your company. So Skrillly has grown from a small company to becoming a leading digital signage platform, powering over 10K screens
Hmm.
worldwide, right?
Yeah.
So can you tell us a bit more about the company and explain the business model of Skrillly?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So it's kind of funny. We me and my co-founder actually ended up in this industry completely accidentally. We were over a series of events ended up acquiring a failing digital signage network in Sweden back 10, 15 years ago actually. And we had no exposure or intention to get into the industry at all, but we got to acquire this company and we realized that we now have screens, but we have no software to drive it. So we went out and did some research in the market and tried to figure out, okay, what kind of solution out there can we find that actually could drive all these screens and manage it in a nice way. Back in those days, there were like not much out there that we found that was interesting. So being two nerds, we decided like, hey, how hard can this be? Let's just write our own stuff. And we started doing that, and we eventually went live with that, which was not the most smooth experience, but we ended up going live with that, and it just so happened that it turned out to be the spring when the first Raspberry Pi was announced. So we looked at the Raspberry Pi. We said, "Hey, actually, this is way better than anything we can actually design ourselves because the economy of scale and all that for hardware boards. Even if we did look at designing some boards, it was just too expensive." So we got on the wait list for the Raspberry Pi, and I got my first Raspberry Pi in June, I think, of that year. And we decided to port what we had written for PCs to the Raspberry Pi, and we open sourced it, put it on GitHub, and we announced it on the Raspberry Pi forum, and it just took off like wildfire. And the reason was partially because a lot of people ended up getting these Raspberry Pis because they wanted them, were super excited about it, but then they got them, they're like, what do now? So we gave them a concrete use case where they actually could use those Raspberry Pis for. And we had really no intention of commercializing that at this point at all. We both basically wrote it to solve our own needs. But we ended up getting so much inbound requests to actually offer this as a service because by that time that's what's today known as Antheus, which is open source digital signage project, which is the most popular by order of magnitude open source digital signage project on GitHub. And basically, we got so many inbound requests for people who wanted a managed version of this that we just couldn't turn that down. So we ended up writing a thin layer to manage all those screens on top of that, which is today what's Screenly. And yeah, we grew from there. So it's essentially organically growth from there, and we've grown over the years, and now we're a much bigger company, obviously, and we attract a lot of talent. We're not only using the Raspberry Pi anymore, and we have other boards
Hmm.
as well that we're working with, and it's yeah, it was a fun project, and we bootstrapped this from there. We never took any venture money or angel money
Hmm.
whatsoever because we bootstrapped everything from there,
That's
which has
awesome.
been
Yeah.
a fantastic journey.
Hmm.
And yeah, today it's used across the globe. I have lost track of how many countries we're deployed in these days, and
Amazing.
it's used for everything from dashboards on the walls in say of like in a network operation center or in even in retail for advertisement. So use case
Yeah.
we never would have thought of. Many.
Yeah, and let's talk a bit more about that. Who are your primary clients right now,
Hmm.
and how do you generate this revenue?
Right. So when you speak about signage in general, it's largely oriented towards retail. Now, it's not the most interesting space for us as a company to go after, because it's kind of like today it's kind of a solved problem to have like a slideshow in a screen, right? It's not sorry, slideshow in a retail environment. So what excites us more is more the technical use cases. So we are slowly shifting more towards going after developers and building tooling that developers love, because that's also, not only is it something that gets me out of bed in the morning far more than selling to retail, it's also something that we understand a lot better. A lot of our competitors in the signage space, they tend to come from marketing or agency background, whereas both me and my co-founder are very much nerds, and we understand the developer market a lot better. So we started building the business around generic signage, but now we're shifting a bit more towards selling to MSPs and towards that side of the business, towards those verticals.
Hmm. And I guess it was in one of your podcasts or somewhere, in your interviews, you shared that Screenly's goal to become a digital signage platform and handle all the backend work of sign management,
Yeah,
enabling other companies to develop on it, right? So,
that's
can you
right.
elaborate more on this vision and how it sets you apart from other digital signage platforms?
Right. So the way I see it, or we see it, is really that a screen is just an empty canvas, right? Yeah, you can put an image up there, right, or anything up there. But if you think about it, what is really a screen? Well, there's not much from a technical perspective difference from like a vending machine than a screen that shows slideshows in a retail environment. So what we are working on building, and this is something that we are about to announce, is a new platform that allows you to build complete solutions on top of our screens, where we're a small cog in a bigger wheel. That's really what we are looking to build, right? So we want to enable developers so that they can easily build applications that runs on these devices, so that they can, instead of having to reinvent the wheel from scratch, they can use our platform to build application, and we take care of whole orchestration, everything from the hardware layer all the way to the software update layer. They just need to worry about the one thing that they actually care about, which is the actual application. So that's exactly what we're building right now, and that's what really, I think, differentiates us from the rest of the market, because we see the world very differently. Because the way, if you look at other verticals, not industries, the shift towards the developers being the decision maker has already happened in so many industries, but it hasn't happened yet in our industry. And that's kind of what we're betting on, that transition. So that's really why we were like probably one of the first one who actually provided a proper API, which is table stakes in most other industries. We now have a CLI, so developers can build tooling and actually work from the terminal. We're building integration with CI/CD pipelines, so customers can actually build application, deploy them, just like they are doing with other solutions. So we see signage as almost like an alternative development deployment target to, say, your web applications or your Cloudflare workers or ever serverless environments, right? We see signage being just another edge computing environment. So I think that philosophy and mentality really sets us apart from other people in the industry.
Got it. Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, it's a good way to scale your company, right?
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
fantastic. Yeah.
Absolutely. And like yeah, like I said, we want to be a small part in a bigger machinery, right? That's
Uh-huh.
kind of how we
Yeah.
see it. Like we don't need to be the end all. We just want to be
Right.
part of the blueprint for a large deployment
Right.
structure.
Yeah. And speaking about that, as a Screenly CEO, you have seen this company grow, and now that now operates in like what 75 or even more countries, like you mentioned, right? So, what strategies did you employ to effectively scale and enter new international markets?
So our stance on this has always been that we want to stick initially to we want to stick to the English speaking world, largely speaking, right? We like if you go down the localization rabbit hole, like there's plenty of money to chase, but it's very much difficult to go after because it creates a lot of tech debt when you actually start to build, and it kind of holds you back. So our stance has always been like we only gonna do the platform in English, and then we can sell that around the world. That's fine. Um, which has worked really well for us because, again, if you are selling to a technical audience, that's not so much of a friction point as it is if you sell into like the marketing side of the organization, where they are probably less comfortable with working in English. So I guess our strategy has never really been so intentional to go after a specific region. I mean, our focus has always been North America. That's where our biggest customer base is at, and then followed by Northern Europe, and where you also like you can operate in English just perfectly fine. But certain regions, we are fully aware that we're not as strong. Like if you go into the DACH region, for instance, or LATAM, you basically need localization to fully thrive in those environments, and that's something that we strategically decided not to do. And that might be something that we will resist in the future, but for now, there is so much room for growth in North America and in Northern Europe that we haven't really felt the need to do that right now, or not will sacrifice a cost for that cost really.
Got it. And were there any specific considerations for each market you entered? For example, let's take North America, the US, right? It's the most competitive market in the world, right?
Yes.
So I'm just curious, can you walk us through your journey to that market?
So both me and my co-founder, we actually started the previous company together when we both were living in the US. So we started with that market, and we have a lot of experience from that market, really. And it's also very different from a lot of perspectives in terms of sales. Like sales cycles are a lot faster in the US than they are in Europe. People are a lot less resistant to change. It's a lot less it's a lot less friction, I think, when you're actually closing deals. Like, yes, there are obviously, when you go up to enterprise level, there are a lot of friction there as well. Obviously, compliance and multiple people need to do sign-offs, but comparatively speaking, it's less friction than it is in Europe, in my experience, in particular, which is that area that we are operating. And even for larger deals, that tend to be true in my experience. So less risk. I mean, yeah, there's less. People are more willing to bet on a smaller company, whereas more conservative markets tend to be more indexing on the brand names more so than taking risk on a newcomer.
Yeah, and for those founders and executives who might be listening to us right now, what should you keep in mind while expanding into new markets? Where should they start? Who can help with that? Do you have any kind of checklist? Can you talk more about it?
So I'm probably not the best person to give advice on going into markets like LATAM or Asia, because that's not my expertise. But I can say, coming from Europe and having spent a lot of time in the US, there's a massive shift in attitudes between Europe and North America. And I think for a lot of, we have no checklist by any means, but I can reflect from my own experience, really, which is you need to be a lot bolder going into North America, because that's kind of what wins you. I think it's the American dream is largely based on the fact that you can make bold bets and they actually pay off. Whereas in Europe, they're a lot more conservative. So I think the playbook is very different for going after North America than it is going after Europe in general, I think. And you can grow a lot faster, and because of that, but you have to be willing to understand. And I think that's a lot of European founders tend to be a bit scared of that, I think, in my experience.
Got it. Okay. And let's talk about your team, right?
Mhm.
So, hiring in different countries brings a unique set of challenges, right? In terms of culture, in terms of compliance,
Yes.
payroll, local employment laws, and so on, right? So, I,
Yes.
I I know that you have teams in what, like in 5 different countries or something like
Almost
that.
10
Oh,
right
almost
now.
10.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Can you share some insights into how you navigate these challenges at
Mm.
Screenly?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a very good question. And the landscape, I would say, in the last 5 years has changed a lot with regards to this. And just speaking about, I'm in the UK, obviously, but we have a team in the US and other people, other places. But in particular, in the UK, like we had to restructure how we do setup of our staff in the UK, for instance, because of IR35 that was pushed through in the UK a few years ago. And you see similar legislation coming through in other countries. So it's very difficult to navigate. It used to be a lot easier, I would say. 10 years ago, it was a lot easier. And I would say there are some markets that we stay clear of because they are too complicated to navigate or too expensive. So like Germany is a good example of that. It's very expensive to bring on people in Germany. Like we've run across talent in Germany that we would like to bring on board, but it just doesn't make financial sense because I can get somebody who's just one country over for half the price or whatever it may be, right? Because at the end of the day, we operate on a global landscape. Where people are is kind of like a detail in the grand scheme of things. And so if you are back 10 years ago, Upwork was the platform. Well, they merged. Upwork was the name of when they merged, but there was another platform they merged with. I'm blanking on the name now. But that used to be fantastic. Like you used to find like a really good talent pool there. They took care of everything, and it was very simple. It's very different today. I think the playbook we used to use for hiring 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, doesn't work anymore. So we're kind of back to the drawing board, kind of like reassessing how we do hiring. So culture is like, from a culture perspective, I don't think we've had too many. I guess partially because we have been a global company from scratch or from day zero. We've never really had too many on one culture. Like we've already had people from multiple cultures from day zero. Because we've been a remote company, we've kind of like, I guess we've had a boiling point from day zero, really. So that's kind of been absorbed, but people are understanding of that. So there are obviously things to be aware of. Different cultures express themselves very differently. So that's something that you as a manager obviously need to be aware of. Like the way you interact and interface with somebody from Eastern Europe or is very different than if you interface with somebody from North America, right? It's extremely different how people express themselves. So you need to be very cognizant of that. But in terms of recruitment, we try to hire global. Like, I fundamentally believe that talent is equally distributed around the globe, right? But access to work isn't, right? And access to training isn't. So it's what we're trying to do is really tap into talent from around the world. Like in the last year, we brought on two new hires from Africa. So we hired 2 people in Nigeria, actually. And it's a new experience for us entirely of understanding how that works and how, in terms of like being integrated with the team, and even more complicated things when you try to have people travel. I can dive into that later, but like that's also like a massive problem that we didn't really anticipate. So we went from Upwork, essentially that was our go-to for all hires about 5-10 years ago, to these days it's more we adopted Workable and use as a platform for hiring these days. And then we don't have a playbook that much anymore. We just federate out to job boards to see we have a decent inbound. And then I think the screening is extremely difficult these days, in particular with the rise of ChatGPT, because it's extremely difficult to figure out if they wrote this reply to that screening question or if they ran that by ChatGPT, right? So there are a lot of things have changed over the last few years in terms of hiring.
Yeah, I cannot agree more. In speaking about, so you hire those teammates as contractors, right?
Or depending on the country, but mostly as contractors, yes.
Contractors, yeah. And do you use employer of record companies like Deal, Oyster for that?
Yeah, we use Deal for our ER, which works great for some countries, but not so much for other countries.
Oh, really?
In terms of cost, right? But it's not so much a problem of the ER as it is of the country we are looking into. Like I said, Germany before is one of the countries that we kind of tend to avoid for that reason. But yeah, we use Deal for running stuff through. But many of our engineers do have their own companies that they run their own invoicing
Yeah.
from. So it depends on, I guess it depends on the seniority level of the person you're hiring as well. I guess higher level developers, more senior developers, are more prone, in my experience, to have their own
hmm
consultancy shop set up versus more junior hire tend to not be.
Yeah, makes sense. And what maybe number one advice would you give to those who are new to building and managing this distributed team, especially a global team, right? Are there any specific advice that you can provide?
Yeah, I mean, I think the number one is work on exciting problems because it's going to be a lot easier to hire. Like if you're working on something
hmm
that your engineers that you're hiring or the people you're hiring are not going to find interesting, it's going to be a lot harder to find people. So I guess that's something that's hard to solve for if you're already in the business, right? But that's, I think, is a massive one. And then the other thing is smart people want to work with other smart people. So it's really important to keep the bar high, because if you allow mediocrity to kind of thrive, then smart people will leave, and that's a death spiral, really. So I think that's really important to keep an eye on. And it is a lot more difficult to attract talent if you are not a name brand, right? So you have to work harder. Like if you're Google or if you're Microsoft, like hiring is not hard because you're always going to have an insane pipeline. Whereas if you are a small company that nobody heard of, like it's a lot harder to find that inbound. So you definitely need to be much more aggressive in your hiring effort and plan that out because it takes a lot more time. I think does that answer the question roughly?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just some advice for talent, for tech talent who are based outside of the US and outside of the UK. Maybe you have some advice for them on how they can join international tech company like Screenly, for example.
I mean, for us, having a strong GitHub profile is by far the most important thing.
Okay.
And if you because that's one of the first thing that we do when we screen for talent is to look at their GitHub profile. If there's nothing strong in there, I think that's, I'm not say it's not a no go, but it's definitely something that will be held against them in terms of if you had other talent that is strong and do have a long, strong GitHub repo. And I understand that it's difficult for some people, in particular, you work more in a commercial environment where you're not allowed to contribute to open source projects. But it is, I think, one of the most important things that we look for. So I think contribute to projects, open source project, even if you're not a developer, like even contributing like documentation is still valuable. And I mean, the one thing actually I forgot to
hmm
mention on managing the remote teams
Okay.
that we found phenomenally important for our company was annual summits, and I kind of alluded to it before we traveled. So what we do
hmm
is we fly in everybody every year to one location, and then we spend
hmm
a week together.
Okay.
When we started doing that first, that was phenomenally important for the culture because it's one thing to spend all day chat with somebody with Slack, but it's a whole different thing to have a beer with somebody and just hang out. And I think that was something that really changed the culture at large when we started doing. And I think that's something that's really important for the culture at large.
Yeah, that's a good one. I
So,
agree with that.
but yeah, visas can be hard. That's kind of what I alluded to before.
That's true. That's true. Okay, so I guess we're good. So thanks a lot, Victor, for sharing your insights on international hiring, on global expansion. Yeah, thanks a lot. We wish you and Screenly all the best in your journey. Appreciate the time very much.
Thank you, Vid. Have a good one.
Tack
Cheers.